Hello everyone, and welcome to Clarity 16.0.3 Supportability and Feature Training. This is Denise Saladay, and today we cover the topic of blueprints enhancements. In the current release, we extended our business roles module in blueprints to actually extend two different types of business roles. The first one is we are allowing the capability to create always true required attributes for sub-objects. In past releases, we've allowed that to be created against master objects, and those kinds of roles were enforced during the Create from Template experience. And you'll notice later on that the type of role here, the same role, will be enforced in sub-objects during the new Create dialog. The second thing that we enhanced in business roles is we've added the capability to create new business roles that are for conditionally required attributes, both at a master object or a sub-object level. We're also providing the capability to control the create experience for sub-objects within its parent master object blueprint. And then, lastly, we're also going to take a look at how these business roles are enforced both during the create and the update experience. Why is this important? In the past, customers were able to use the Create from Template experience for master object instances, and they wanted the same type of functionality for sub-objects within these same master objects. They want a form-like experience where they can control what attributes are required, or even which ones that they would like or optional that they want users to populate. And they also want to have a different experience based on the blueprint that the parent belongs to, and this capability will be flexible enough to support that requirement. Next, we've had a lot of customer demand for the capability to support business roles for conditionally required attributes. So we've provided this release for both master objects and sub-objects. We're also enforcing some of these required attribute business roles during the update of data in both the master object and sub-object to help customers with their data integrity needs. Next, let's take a look on how to create required always true business roles for sub-objects. First, you need to put your blueprint in edit mode, and you would actually enter the role name and description like you normally would for any other business role. Now, under conditions, you want to enable the always true toggle. And under actions, you'll select required attribute. And lastly, from the drop-down box under actions, you'll select which attributes you want to be always true. In this example, what we have is we have defined the charge code attribute that we want to be always true for tasks. Once you're done creating the business role, you'll click the Create button, and then you'll enable it and publish your blueprint, and then your changes will be published for the role. And an important note is that anytime that you copy blueprints from one blueprint to a new blueprint, these business rules will be copied along with it. This always true business role will be enforced during the sub-object instance creation dialog, the new dialog that we'll be looking at a little bit later. It's not enforced during creation when you're in the grid with the quick create plus, the board, or the timeline. When you create the business role, it has to be done in the blueprint for its parent master object. And you can only create them and select attributes that belong to the target object. So for example, we're looking at the task object, and in the conditions in the actions builder, you would only see attributes that belong to the task object. And those sub-objects which are supported by this always true business rule are the same ones that are supported with the create dialogue capability that we'll be looking at shortly. Next, I'd like to cover our second enhancement to business rules, which is the capability to create conditional required attributes on either master objects or sub-objects within blueprints. Like any other business rules, you would put your blueprint in edit mode to make any rule changes, and you would populate your rule name and description and target object as you would with any other rules. But instead of checking always true this time, we're going to leave conditions toggled on. And in this case, what you'll do is you'll build actual conditions here by selecting an attributes that should be evaluated to build your condition. In the top example for the project, we said active equals yes. What you also need to do is under the Actions section, you would select required attributes, and then you would select those attributes that you want to be required as part of this role for the project. In this example, we selected both manager and priority when projects are active. And whenever you're finished creating the role, you would just click Create, enable your role, and then publish it. And you'll see the bottom example is the same type of conditionally required attribute, only it's for some attributes on the task sub-object for the project. And you can see that in the conditions, we said where is task equals yes, status equals started, and if those conditions are met, then we want to actually have the task owner as required. I want to call out a few important points, and that is this rule is enforced during update, not during the create experience. And as I noted before, any sub-object business rules have to be created under the parent master object. And you'll see here on this slide that there's a list of the objects and their sub-objects that are supported for these conditional required business attribute rules. For master objects, we're supporting them on the projects, ideas, custom investments, and the sub-objects that are supported on projects are tasks, risks, issues, changes, status, baselines, and any custom sub-objects that are level 2, which is one level below the project level. For ideas, it's similar: risks, issues, changes, status, and any child custom sub-objects at level 2. And for custom investments, it's tasks, risks, issues, changes, status, and any level 2 custom sub-objects. To control the sub-object creation experience, we've added 2 new toggles in the master object blueprint. The first toggle is enable quick create, and what that is if that's enabled, and it will be by default, so it doesn't have any upgrade impact, that just enables the quick create plus in the grid, and also for tasks it allows you to quick create in the timeline in the board and the new card. It just pretty much supports the capability that's there today. Now the second toggle, which is enable create dialogue, that is the new functionality, and we're shipping that toggled off by default because we don't want to have an upgrade impact. But that is the toggle that actually enables the new sub-object create experience. So to see an example of this in action, for tasks, you can see the top screenshot has the enable create dialog after we've enabled it and published it. And the bottom screenshot actually has a new button called new task, which will, when you click on that, that will actually bring up the new task dialog that users can use to create instance data for tasks. And each sub-object will have its own new button. And for tasks specifically, it will apply to the timeline and board views as well. An important item to note is the new toggles don't have any impact to or update existing security access rights. So what that means is users are still going to need to have their regular update and create rights that they have today in Clarity, but they'll also, in addition to that, need these toggles to be set accordingly to control the create experience that we want them to have. And the last thing in this slide is a supported list of sub-objects that are supported in this new creation dialog. And you can see that it matches the same list of the business rules that apply to it that we covered earlier. For each sub-object, we needed to provide a mechanism to define the actual layout of the creation experience. So similar to what we did with master objects in create from template, we have the same type of functionality available for the sub-object. Except while you're in the sub-object configuration screen, you would click on the Edit Module Details button, which would take you to the bottom screenshot, which is the place where you would define the layout for the creation experience for the users. So on the left pane, you can see that there's all of the attributes listed for the task, and all you need to do is drag and drop them into the right side of the screen to add them to the layout. In either the layout or the fields pane, those attributes which are required in Studio or have always true business roles applied to them will appear with an asterisk. If the layout doesn't contain an attribute that is required either in Studio or as an always true business role, what will happen is whenever the user clicks the new button to create an instance, it's going to automatically be appended to the new create modal, similar to how the create from template works today for master objects. But if those attributes that are required are missing from the layout and they have either a default value or auto numbering turned on in Studio, then they will not append because they already have a required value. And the only attribute data types that are excluded from this capability are TSV, attachment, and rich text. Once the layout is complete, you just need to click Publish to save your layout changes, just like you would for any other blueprint changes. And one thing that's important to note is these settings, the toggles as well as the layouts, when you copy blueprints, these items will be copied as well to the new blueprints. So now let's take a look at the create experience when creating new sub-object instances. Because my Enable Create dialog toggle was enabled, you can see that for the task, I now have a new task button. And once I click on that button, I'll get the new task dialog. In the dialog, users can see which fields are required, and the administrators may have configured some fields in here that are optional that they may want them to fill out too, and those won't have an asterisk. But you can see that the charge code field that we had required for tasks is showing up here as blank with an asterisk next to it saying that we have to fill it out. Now the new sub-object dialog will show the create button gray until all required attributes have been populated, at which time after that you can see from the bottom screenshot the create button will turn blue, and they can actually create the instance and save it right there. And the charge code was actually defined from our always true business rule for the task. But for task, this new button will also show up in the timeline and the board views as well, since it's supported by that sub-object. And users will not be able to populate or save instances until all the required fields are actually populated in the dialog. And one important thing to consider is the create dialog for a particular sub-object may be different across other investments. For example, you could have two different projects that may be tied to different blueprints with different create layouts for tasks. So in that case, depending on which task that you're creating instances for, the create dialog may be different. In my blueprint, if the charge code, which is based on a always true business rule that I defined in my blueprint, but if that was not included in my layout for the create screen, it would have been automatically appended anyways into this new sub-objects modal. Now let's take a look at soft required business rules in action during the update experience. During update, when a user attempts to update the master object or sub-object instances for either projects, ideas, and custom investments, whenever they're in either the properties, the details flyout, the grid, or timeline screens, and they don't have any, they have some required fields that need populated, they're going to get this new required fields pop-up. And this required fields pop-up is going to contain attributes that are required both from always true business rules as well as conditional ones. If you recall on the project rules example that we were looking at earlier, the strategic sponsor was always true business role on the project, and the manager and priority attributes were only required once the project was in active status. So once the user then, they have an ability right now, they can actually cancel out of this without filling out any required attributes. They can escape, they can hard refresh, navigate away, and that's why we're calling it soft required fields. So let's say, for example, that the user decides to cancel out of this and not enter these required attributes. What will happen is any user that goes into this particular project and updates any attribute, we'll say the start date, as soon as they make that update, they're going to get this required fields pop up again, saying, hey, you know, as a reminder, these fields are required and somebody needs to fill them out. So if, for example, you know, let's say that the manager and strategic sponsor, you know what those values are, you can easily go into the grid or any of the other screens and update those values. And let's say the priority is something that you have to follow up on and you don't know that right away. What will happen is anytime you or any other user goes back in and tries to update any data on this project for any attribute, they'll get a new modal, but it'll just have the priority attribute in because it's the only one that's left that that's required and not populated. Now the below example is the same scenario, only it's for a task, the sub-object on the project. And if you remember, we had two business roles for the task against a project, and the first one was that the charge code was always true as required, and the task owner was conditionally true only if the task was started. And if the user goes and they fill out the charge code and the task owner and they select a value, you can see that the save button in the required fields modal actually turns blue, and they'll actually be able to save this data once all the required attributes are populated. We also have the soft required attribute business role enforced for both projects, ideas, and custom investments in the hierarchy crossed investment grid, and it behaves the same way as it does for projects and tasks that we just looked at. While updating instance data for both master objects and sub-objects, attributes that have required business roles, when they're null, of course, as we saw, they'll get the required fields modal and they'll have to populate them, and they'll keep getting that until they're populated. But once they're populated, the experience is they can't null them out, as you can see from this screen. So if you go in, and this is a task example, if they go in and try and null out the charge code, which is always true, they're going to get an error message here, and they won't be able to do that. It won't even allow them to save it, so it'll clear it out. And it'll work that way for both master objects and sub-objects instances on ideas, projects, and custom investments. This will be enforced in the properties. The details fly out the grid and the timeline screens and will apply to both always true and conditionally true required attribute business rules. And we just wanted to call out a couple of important items during update for the soft required business rules. First is the order that the attributes should appear in the required fields dialog is alphabetical. The next thing is always true and conditionally required attribute business rules they're totally ignored during bulk update and multi-paste update operations, as well as your fill handle copy. But even though those business rules are ignored during those bulk update operations, it's important to remember that the first time that a user goes into any of those projects where this operation broke or triggers some business rules, that they're going to get the required field modal again and be forced they can cancel out of it, but they'll be reminded again that they have to fill out some required fields and there's some missing, so they can handle it at that time. Now, we don't expect this to be too common of a use case, but it's possible that it might happen. So if you have some scenarios where you have conditional required attributes, and let's say that if a project is active, A and B must be required, but you have another conditionally required that if B is filled out, then C and D have to be required attributes. And of course you wouldn't know that until B was filled out, right? So in this case, what you have is a cascading dependent level of conditional required attributes. Now, if you have your business rules set up this way, the behavior is the initial required fields dialog. We're going to show you everything that we know about that meets a required attribute role, right? That triggers a role. We're going to put it on the first modal, and if values that are updated in that one trigger another one, we'll close that one and pop up another required fields dialog, and it'll be right over top of the other one. It'll be in the same place, so it should be easy visible, and it will just have the newly ones that were just triggered from the condition. So I mean, it's impossible to predict what customers are going to do, and when one rule triggers another rule, there really wasn't a more elegant way to handle this, and we think this will work well, so that's the way that we decided to handle it. And last, below is a list of the supported master objects and sub-objects for the soft required business rules. We wanted to provide you with a summary table that's easy to read of the required attributes and how they work and where they work and what type of business rules apply where here in this chart. So you can see that the always true required attributes rules apply to both master and sub objects for both the create dialog and the update experience. And conditional required attributes do not apply in the create dialog, but they do appear in and they're supported in the master objects and the sub objects during update. And we also recapped where they apply, like in the properties, details, flyout grid, as well as the supported master objects and sub objects for the feature. Now it's time for the demonstration portion of the supportability training. We'll go into the product and I'll show you how to create business rules for both always true and conditionally required attributes. Then we will go into blueprint configuration and we'll look at the toggles that control the create experience as well as configuring the new subobject create dialog. And lastly, we're going to see in action the new create dialog for subobjects and the required business rules in the product. First, we'll take a look in Clarity at the blueprint rule changes that we made. So this is the one that we created for subobjects, and we're using task as an example. So when you're working with the create dialog for task, you want to make sure that you set your condition and while you create it to be always true. And then you want to make sure that you select required attributes. And in this case, I created a business rule for charge code on the task that's required. The other type of business rule we're going to look at today is conditionally required attributes. And this will apply to both master objects and subobjects, but the example that we're looking at today is for subobject for task, and you want to make sure that your conditions toggle is set. And in this case, I selected some attributes from the task, and I selected is task equals yes where status equals started, and I selected required attributes from the pull down here, and I'm making task owner required under these conditions. Conditionally required attributes will be enforced during update, except during bulk update operations, and they will be enforced in the grid, the property screen, the flyout, the timeline, and the hierarchy cross investment grid. Next, we're going to update this blueprint to enable the create dialog for the subobject of task. As you can see, the enable create dialog is disabled, and we'll just enable that right now. And then we'll go in and change the layout that users will see whenever tasks are created using the new task button. As you can see, name, start, and finish are required, and we're adding these by default. So let's just add another attribute. We'll just add status. And you can just drag and drop these attributes over, and you can see that anything that is either blueprint required or studio required is going to have an asterisk. Now normally the administrator would configure both the charge code and the task owner attributes to this create dialog because the charge code was always true during creation, and the task owner field is conditionally true whenever tasks are active. But in this case, I want to leave them off because I want to show you the append behavior that you'll see. So let me just publish this blueprint change. And then we can go look at these changes in action. So if we go to projects, and we'll take a look at CRM Enhancements project because it's using my blueprint here. And we'll go into tasks. You can see now we have the create dialog enabled for new tasks. It's enabled here in the grid. I gotta select an item here. On the board and in the timeline. So let's go back to the board. And we'll just click New. So as you can see, I have the new task dialog box, the required attributes both from a business role, etc. is showing up here. And you can see that the charge code, which is always true, is showing up, and the conditional rules do not show up in the create dialog. They only are enforced during update. So that's why we're not seeing the task owner. So let's just create this task here. And you can see the button here is still, the create button is blue because we haven't entered all required attributes, and you can cancel out of this. So if I were to cancel out of this, it wouldn't save the record. But you can see that charge code, which is always true, is required. So let's pick a charge code for this one, and now the create button is disabled and cancels disabled. So we'll just create that. You can see how that is how records are created. So in summary, any required attributes that are defined with always true business roles will automatically be appended to the creation dialog, just like it behaves today in create from template for master objects. However, if the attribute has a default set up in Studio or has auto numbering turned on, it will not be appended to the layout. Last, we're going to take a look at how conditional attribute roles are applied for sub-objects. And we'll look at the task example here. You can see the defined scope change in control task doesn't have a charge code, and it is a started status. So if we go into this task, and we'll go into the grid first. If you go in and just update any attribute here, you can see that you'll get the create dialog, and it knows that the always true business role for charge code wasn't populated, and task owner, which is conditionally true because the project is started, needs to be populated as well. One thing you should notice is that both of these attributes need to be populated in order for the save button to be blue and activated. And users can actually cancel out of this without saving. And let's just do that now to see the behavior. So if we go and we still navigate and we come back to this task and we want to update something different, we'll do the finish date this time. You can see that you'll always continue to get this task dialog for required fields until this task has both of these required attributes filled out. So let's populate them. You can see the save button's activated. Now actually save them. So now when I go in and make any updates to this task, you'll notice that I don't get that dialog any longer. So you'll see this behavior in the hierarchy cross-investment grid, as well as the details flyout, the property screen for master objects, the timeline, and the board where applicable. And just to show you how this looks in the details flyout, let's change this status back to not started. We'll just pick a task that doesn't have any actuals. This one's already not started. So let's change it to started. And because it's conditionally required and it's started now, we'll have to enter a task owner. And we'll save it. So you can see that the enforcement works here as well. And the last thing that I wanted to show you here is that once a required attribute is populated, you cannot go in and null them out. You can see that you get a toast message, and it won't null it out. You can see that the same thing applies to always true business rules as well. We'll try and change the charge code. You can see that you get that as well. And that concludes the demo portion of the supportability training session. And this concludes the supportability training section on Blueprint enhancements. Thank you.